Welcome, deep divers. Have you ever just had that feeling that something really profound is shifting, underneath everything? That maybe the bedrock of our modern world, this whole system we call capitalism, might be undergoing some kind of radical change, or maybe even, well, approaching an endgame. Today, that question isn't just like a philosophical thought experiment, it's a really central debate. Is capitalism the engine that's driven so much? Is it actually in a state of terminal decline? So we're taking a deep dive into some really fascinating, sometimes unsettling analyses of where capitalism is right now and where it might be heading. And our sources for this, they aren't just looking at, the usual economic numbers. They're treating capitalism as this complex social order, a whole way of life, constantly changing and, well, maybe currently unraveling. Our mission here is to unpack these different perspectives for you, to help you understand the historical forces at play, identify the symptoms, the very real symptoms of what lots of people are calling a systemic crisis, and maybe even peek into what a world after capitalism could look like, even if, there's no obvious successor waiting in the wings. If you're looking to navigate this incredibly complex landscape, we're here to help you get up to speed quickly and thoroughly.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating when you look at these analyses is um, how this idea that capitalism might contain the seeds of its own, well, demise isn't actually new. Not at all. In fact, right from the beginning, like the early 1800s, many of the big theories about capitalism were also fundamentally theories of crisis.
That's a really powerful point,
Yeah.
because we often think of capitalism as this, super resilient system always adapting. But you're saying that figures like Marx, Engels, even Keynes, Weber, Schumpeter, these giants of economic thought, they were already predicting its end, though maybe for different reasons.
Precisely. Marx and Engels, for example, they foresaw crises coming from, say, overproduction or maybe underconsumption, which would lead to a falling rate of profit. That was their angle. Keynes, later on, he worried more about market saturation, like what happens when everyone basically has what they need. Then you had Karl Polanyi, who pointed to the exhaustion of new land and labor for colonization, both literally and, metaphorically speaking. Rosa Luxemburg even brought up the potential threat of technological stagnation. But what our sources really emphasize is that, okay, while those specific predictions didn't pan out exactly as imagined, capitalism did keep facing crises. It survived them, yes, but always, and this is key, at the price of deep transformations. And often it relied on what they call contingent exogenous supports, basically, outside help or forces that it couldn't actually generate from within.
Right, so its survival wasn't ever guaranteed. It always needed some kind of external intervention or had to radically restructure itself just to pull back from the brink, which suggests, I guess, that its current form isn't necessarily permanent either.
Exactly. And well, that leads us right to the critical question for today. What's really different now? Our sources are suggesting that contemporary capitalism isn't just facing one crisis like in the past. It's more like a multi-morbidity.
Multi-morbidity.
Yeah, think of it like a patient with several different illnesses at the same time, and they all interact to make each other worse. It's described as a syndrome of accumulated weaknesses, where these different disorders kind of feed off each other.
Wow, a multi-morbidity for capitalism. That's quite a stark image. And you're saying our sources have pinpointed, what, 5 critical systemic disorders? And these have been getting worse in advanced capitalist economies since, like, the 70s, and then really accelerated after the 2008 crash.
That's the argument, yes. 5 key areas.
Okay, let's really get into these. Let's dissect them. Where do we start? The first one is stagnation, right? This idea of persistent declining economic growth.
That's right. We're seeing this consistent slowdown, particularly in the rich post-industrial countries. There's economist Robert Gordon, for instance, who argues that the really massive transformative innovations, things like huge leaps in transport speed or getting running water everywhere, those are kind of one-off events, So now we might be in an era of what people call secular stagnation, just a long-term chronic slowdown in growth. What's really striking, though, is that the economic elites, they almost seem resigned to this low or maybe even no aggregate growth.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you see these incredibly high profits being made, especially in speculative finance, often fueled by cheap money from central banks. And this, of course, makes the struggle for resources, just the struggle for survival, much, much more intense for most ordinary people.
Okay, so if the whole economic pie isn't really growing much, then who's getting the bigger slices? Which I guess leads us straight into the second disorder our sources talk about, oligarchic redistribution.
Exactly. This refers to that dramatic and really persistent rise in economic inequality, both income and wealth, that we've seen building for decades now.
Yeah.
It's a profound shift of resources, but not from the top down. It's, as they put it, from the bottom to the top. Some sources even describe it quite starkly as an extraction of resources from increasingly impoverished, declining societies. And importantly, they're not just talking about places like, say, Russia or Greece anymore. They're increasingly pointing to places like the U.S., too. That old Keynesian bond, the sort of post-war idea that rising profits and rising wages for everybody went hand in hand, well, that seems to be largely severed.
You mentioned those Citigroup Plutonomy memos earlier. Can you just quickly remind us what those were about? Why are they relevant here?
Sure. These were internal memos from Citigroup back in, I think, 2005, 2006. And they basically told their wealthiest clients that, look, your prosperity doesn't really depend on the economic health of the wider population anymore.
No.
Or even on national growth. They described an economy increasingly dominated by and really only serving the very, very rich, a plutonomy.
So literally an economy for the rich run by the rich. That's what the memos were saying.
That was the essence, yes. It highlights this trend where the focus for the super rich shifts towards these transnational fortunes.
Yeah.
And it feeds into this idea of an end game mode.
Yeah.
You know, cash in your chips, maybe burn some bridges, and don't worry too much about the scorched earth left behind.
That's, yeah, incredibly stark is the word. Okay, so we have stagnation, wealth hoarding at the top, and then the third disorder is the plundering of the public domain. What does that look like for, everyday people?
Well, it looks like this systematic underfunding and often the privatization of things we used to take for granted as public services. Infrastructure, too. Think healthcare, education, roads, bridges, all that stuff. Our sources trace this shift over time, from what they call the tax state, where governments funded public goods through taxes, to the debt state, starting around the 1980s, borrowing heavily, and then more recently into a consolidation or austerity state, especially since the 90s and 2000s. And a big driver behind this, according to the analyses, is the increased ability of corporations and wealthy individuals to move money around the globe. Capital mobility, tax flight, tax evasion, even just shopping for the lowest tax regimes.
So basically, companies and rich people find ways to pay less tax, and that forces governments to cut back on services for everyone else.
That's the core mechanism described, yes. And the result is often deep cuts in things like Social Security, maintaining physical infrastructure, investing in human capital like education. This growing public poverty then creates a kind of vacuum. And that vacuum is sometimes filled by what the sources call oligarchic philanthropy, which sounds nice, but some analyses describe it as almost a neo-feudal relationship.
Neo-feudal, how so?
Well, because private wealth effectively steps in to provide services that the state used to provide, but they do it on their own terms, with their own priorities, and inevitably wielding their own kind of power.
Right. Private benefactors replacing public services. That's a really powerful and, frankly, unsettling thought. Okay, let's turn to number 4, corruption. And our sources define this pretty broadly, don't they? It's not just about, brown envelopes stuffed with cash.
No, exactly. It's defined much more broadly as a gross violation of legal rules and systematic betrayal of trust, often used for competitive advantage or personal enrichment. They point particularly to the financial sector, where it's seen as endemic. Huge profits made by essentially bending or breaking rules around insider trading, mortgage lending, money laundering, fixing interest rates, you name it. Just think about the sheer scale, something like $260 billion paid out in out-of-court settlements by major American and Western European banks just between 2008 and 2014 for all sorts of legal breaches tied to the financial crisis.
And the crucial point, as the sources note, is that basically none of these cases actually went to trial.
Right.
Which doesn't exactly inspire public confidence.
Not really, no. It points to what one analysis calls a kind of deep empathy from the legal system towards these institutions. And beyond the settlements, there's that whole issue of the revolving door between Wall Street and government positions. You see individuals like Robert Rubin, Henry Paulson, Larry Summers moving seamlessly between top jobs in finance and, say, the U.S. Treasury. Or consider Eric Holder. As Attorney General under Obama, he ended up negotiating settlements with the very financial firms he'd represented when he was on leave from his Wall Street law firm. And famously, not a single high-level banker was prosecuted during his tenure for crisis-related activities. This kind of thing fosters widespread cynicism. It makes people feel like capitalism is just, an institutionalized way for the connected rich to get even richer. And that erodes what they call its consequentialist moral justification, basically. The argument that the system works because ultimately it benefits everyone. That argument gets harder to make.
A system losing its moral legitimacy in a way. Okay, that brings us to the fifth disorder, global anarchy. How does that fit into this overall picture of capitalism maybe declining?
Well, historically, capitalism seems to have needed a stable global center, a hegemon, to kind of maintain order and set the rules. First Britain, then the U.S. after World War II. But the argument now is that the U.S. is increasingly unable, or maybe unwilling, to play that post-war role effectively. And there isn't a clear successor or a stable multipolar order to take its place yet. You see challenges to the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. You see the impact of U.S. military campaigns that ended in, well, defeat or stalemate starting back in the 70s. This seems to have led to a reluctance for large-scale ground wars, replaced by a reliance on things like secretive special forces, drone strikes, unmanned aircraft, secret prison camps, and this massive expansion of comprehensive surveillance. All attempts to maintain some kind of order, but perhaps less effectively, and certainly less visibly.
So it's a shift towards a more covert, maybe less stable way of trying to manage global affairs.
That seems to be the idea. And then you add the rise of China, a really formidable economic and increasingly military rival, and it casts even more doubt on whether that old kind of stable global order can be easily restored. This absence of a clear, unchallenged global leader leaves a kind of vacuum, contributing to this pervasive sense of instability and, well, anarchy.
Wow. Okay, just taking those 5 points together, the stagnation, the wealth concentration, the crumbling public sphere, the systemic corruption, and this breakdown of global order that paints, well, a pretty grim picture. So what does all this multi-morbidity actually mean for democracy? Our sources seem to connect these disorders directly to what's happening in our political systems.
Yeah, if you connect the dots, the picture that emerges is that the, let's call it the shotgun marriage between capitalism and democracy, the one really forged after 1945, seems to have largely broken down. It's worth remembering, historically, capitalism and democracy were often seen as, well, adversaries, weren't they? Capitalists often feared majority rule, potentially threatening property rights, and workers often feared authoritarianism. That post-war period, with Keynesian economics guiding policy, that was really the exception, a time when economic growth and social stability seemed to sort of go hand in hand, at least in the developed West.
But that relationship fundamentally shifted, didn't it? What was the core change there?
Well, the sources describe it as a major shift away from Keynesianism, which, broadly speaking, aimed for growth through redistribution, boosting demand from the bottom up, towards what's often called Hayekianism or neoliberalism, which prioritizes growth through essentially redistribution from the bottom up. Stronger incentives for the winners, harsher discipline for the losers. And under this newer model, democracy itself is increasingly framed not as a partner, but as a potential drag on efficiency, even a threat to economic performance if it tries to interfere too much with market outcomes.
And this isn't just abstract theory, right? We can actually see this reflected in the weakening of democratic institutions. What does that look like on the ground?
Absolutely. We've seen things like declining voter turnout, especially among lower-income groups who feel the system isn't working for them. We see political party systems fragmenting, the rise of so-called populist protest parties. At the same time, union membership has plummeted in many countries, and strikes, which were historically a really important channel for democratic participation by workers, have become incredibly rare. And what's particularly interesting is how the main arena for arguing about distribution, about who gets what, has shifted. It moved from, say, national labor markets and collective bargaining to electoral politics, then increasingly into private credit markets, and finally into these really opaque international financial markets. Decisions get made there that are completely disconnected from everyday experience and, as one source puts it, entirely impenetrable to outsiders.
So decisions that affect millions of people are being made by a tiny group, often behind closed doors, with almost zero democratic accountability. That sounds like a huge change in what government even is.
It really is. Governments find themselves caught between, fiscal pressures, often linked to that declining tax base we talked about, and the demands of these global markets.
Yeah.
They morph from tax states into debt states, and then into what are called consolidation states, basically, austerity states. And in that role, some sources argue, they effectively become debt-collecting agencies on behalf of a global oligarchy of investors.
Oh.
On top of that, you have institutions like central banks, think the European Central Bank, ECB, or the U.S. Federal Reserve, becoming these incredibly powerful quasi-sovereign economic governments. They're largely insulated from direct democratic control, and their primary mandate often seems to be acting as guardians of the health of private financial firms, maybe more than the public interest directly.
Right. So institutions like the Fed or the ECB are making massive economic calls with very little democratic input, operating almost like, well, separate, unelected governments.
That's the core argument, yes. And you can see it quite clearly, for instance, in European integration, where many sources argue it has effectively de-democratized European capitalism. National parliaments have lost significant budgetary power to these supranational bodies. And it's a striking irony, isn't it, that the elite pressure for what's termed the economic neutralization of egalitarian democracy continues unabated.
Economic neutralization of egalitarian democracy.
Yeah.
That phrase definitely sticks with you. It suggests this isn't just happening passively, but is like an ongoing project.
Which then raises another really important question. What happens when capitalism's relentless drive to expand markets runs smack into fundamental limits? Limits within society itself. Here, our sources often draw on Karl Polanyi's famous concept of fictitious commodities. He was talking specifically about labor, land, which includes nature, and money.
Fictitious commodities, right. So these are things that aren't actually made to be sold on a market, but capitalism treats them as if they were.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Polanyi's point was that you can only commodify these things, turn them into market goods up to a certain point. If you push it too far, complete commodification actually destroys them.
Mm-hmm.
And in destroying them, it ultimately obstructs rather than enhances capital accumulation. So capitalism kind of needs these limits. It needs things to be partially outside the market to survive long term. But its own internal logic constantly pushes it to try and break down those limits, and that creates these critical crisis zones.
Okay, let's break down those crisis zones, starting with money. How does that fit the fictitious commodity idea?
Well, the 2008 financial crisis is often cited as a perfect example of the excessive commodification of money. What happened was that deregulation, starting really in the 1980s, led to this seemingly limitless supply of cheap credit. And finance got incredibly creative, inventing ever more complex products, derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, all that stuff. This created huge asset bubbles. For a while, this financialization maybe looked like the last remaining way to restore growth, especially for an overextended U.S. economy reliant on consumer debt, but ultimately it became completely self-destructive.
Right. And then there's nature, or a land in Polanyi's terms. This feels incredibly relevant today with climate change and resource depletion.
Absolutely urgent. There's this growing, undeniable unease about the fundamental tension between capitalism's need for infinite expansion and the reality of finite natural resources. Our sources are pretty blunt about it. The energy consumption patterns of rich capitalist countries cannot be extended to the rest of the world without destroying essential preconditions of human life. Full stop. So we're in this kind of race, aren't we? A race between the advancing exhaustion of nature on one side and maybe technological innovation saving the day on the other. But a huge question mark hangs over how we can possibly mobilize the enormous collective resources needed to tackle this, especially in societies that are increasingly defined by possessive individualism, that intense focus on individual rights and private property over collective action and well-being.
A real collective action problem, then. Okay, finally, what about labor? How has the deep commodification of labor played out, impacting us as individuals?
Well, the commodification of human labor, our ability to work, has also reached what many see as a critical point: deregulation of labor markets, intense international competition. It's led to much more precarious employment for a huge segment of the population. The gig economy is just one example. We've seen working hours for families actually increase, often because women's participation in the workforce has had to compensate for stagnant male wages just to keep households afloat. Alongside this, you have the decline of trade unions we mentioned, and persistent endemic unemployment or underemployment, even in supposedly advanced economies. And one point the sources make is how things like sweatshops have largely been pushed to the global periphery, conveniently out of sight, out of mind for consumers in the wealthy centers.
And this pressure, this commodification, it seems to penetrate even deeper, right? Right into our personal lives, our family lives. That seems like a profound intrusion.
It really is. You hear constant complaints about work bleeding into family life, this relentless pressure for an unending race to upgrade one's human capital. You always have to be learning, adapting, making yourself more marketable. And this logic extends even to the commodification of child rearing. Parents increasingly have to externalize childcare either to the market or the state just to manage work demands. Some sources even point to something they cautiously term social eugenics.
Wait, social eugenics? That's a really loaded term. Can you maybe unpack what the sources mean by that a bit more? What are the implications?
It's definitely a provocative term. It refers to policies, or perhaps more subtle societal pressures, that tend to encourage certain demographic groups. usually those perceived as more economically desirable or productive, like the educated middle classes to have children. While other groups might face increasing economic or social disincentives or just practical obstacles to doing so. The implication is a kind of subtle steering of society, where decisions about having children become less of a universal human experience and more entangles with producing specific types of future workers or citizens deemed valuable by the market. It's a stark example, really, of how deeply that market logic can penetrate and potentially reshape even the most fundamental aspects of human life. And alongside this, you see many parents having, as one source puts it, cheerfully adjusted to a high-pressure way of life. It's like a new Protestant ethic applied to family life, taking pride in enduring hardship for your career, your income, and especially for maximizing the human capital formation of your children.
Wow. That idea of social eugenics, even subtly applied, is genuinely disturbing to think about. It really feels like, as you said earlier, capitalism might have vanquished its traditional opposition, but in doing so, has it become its own worst enemy? Like the very forces that used to contain it, maybe strong unions, social democratic states, certain traditions forces that actually supported its long-term stability, have been weakened or maybe even destroyed by capitalism's own success.
That's a central argument here, yes.
Hmm.
And it leads us to perhaps the most unsettling idea presented in these analyses, that we're not necessarily heading towards socialism or some other clearly defined successor system that people used to talk about. Instead, we might be entering what they call a lasting interregnum.
An interregnum. Okay, that sounds like
Right.
being stuck in limbo or between worlds.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean for society? And for us as individuals living through it?
It describes a period of deep indeterminacy, maybe social entropy or just plain disorder, a time when unexpected things can happen at any time. The suggestion from these sources is that capitalism isn't being overthrown. It's more like it's vanishing on its own, sort of collapsing from internal contradictions, and paradoxically, partly because it vanquished its enemies, the forces that might have shaped a transition. So what you get is a breakdown of system integration at the macro level. The big structures become unstable, unpredictable, and that leaves individuals down at the micro level feeling deprived of institutional structuring and collective support. Society becomes, in their words, deinstitutionalized or under-institutionalized. It feels ungovernable, and people's expectations are only stabilized by local improvisation. You just figure things out as you go.
So the weight falls incredibly heavily back onto the individual then? In a world where the old rules and safety nets are maybe disappearing?
Exactly. Individuals are left to kind of struggle to protect themselves from looming accidents and structural pressures. They're driven by basic impulses, fear and greed, as one source puts it, and just elementary interests in individual survival.
Wow.
Because society, in this view, has lost the ability to provide its members with effective protection and proven templates for social action. The instruction manual is missing.
And yet, somehow, this potentially chaotic, undergoverned state gets spun ideologically as something positive, right? Like freedom or autonomy.
Yes, that's the power of the prevailing neoliberal ethos. This condition is often glorified as liberty, as individual autonomy. It's presented as an adventure playground where your personal resourcefulness, your hustle, maybe just luck, is what leads to success and wealth. Think about how central buzzwords like disruption and resilience have become. They're key parts of this behavioral program that demands constant competitive self-improvement and the untiring cultivation of one's marketable human capital. It's framed as almost heroic, but it places an immense, often isolating burden on individuals.
So it's not some grand revolution changing everything overnight. It's more like a slow burn, maybe a death from 1,000 cuts, as one of the sources apparently described it. And the really alarming part of this interregnum idea seems to be that while we can maybe see the old system disintegrating, there are no new elites able to design and eager to install a new order. There's no clear replacement taking shape.
Indeed, that's a key point. Both capitalism's traditional movers and shakers and their various oppositions seem to lack the capacity or maybe the vision to act collectively and forge something new. The old theories, Marxist, Keynesian, whatever, they seem to have lost a lot of their predictive power in this new landscape. Even capitalism's supposed master technicians, the people who are meant to know how to keep the engine running, like central bankers trying desperately to manage things with tools like quantitative easing, even they, as one source puts it, have no clue today how to make the system whole again.
What an incredibly sobering but really essential deep dive this has been. It feels like we've covered so much ground. We've looked at capitalism's inherent instability, how its past resilience often depended on these deep changes and outside help. And we've unpacked those five systemic disorders: the stagnation, the oligarchic redistribution, the plundering of public resources, the deep corruption, and the sense of global anarchy, all contributing to this current state of multi-morbidity.
And we saw how all of this seems to have fundamentally broken that post-war link between capitalism and democracy, shifting power away from citizens and towards these opaque global markets and technocratic institutions. We also dug into Polanyi's fictitious commodities, money, nature, and our own labor, and explored how pushing their commodification too far creates these dangerous crisis zones, potentially threatening the very fabric of society.
Which leaves us with this really unsettling prospect of a prolonged interregnum. Not a clear transition, but this period of deep uncertainty, maybe social decay, where the system breaks down without a ready replacement. A time when, as you said, the individual is left scrambling to navigate a deinstitutionalized world, relying on improvisation, all while carrying the immense weight of that neoliberal pressure for constant self-improvement and resilience. So here's the final thought to leave you with, building on all this. If, as these sources compellingly suggest, the social contract of democratic capitalism really is broken, if our collective institutions are failing more and more to provide reliable protection or clear paths forward, what actually happens when individual resourcefulness, when that cheerful optimism and resilience we're all encouraged to cultivate, simply isn't enough anymore to navigate the pervasive uncertainty and instability? When that dominant neoliberal narrative of life as an adventure playground finally cracks into the strain, giving way to a widespread, undeniable frustration of individual hopes, projects, and ambitions for the vast majority, what then? It's a profound question, and one that these analyses really challenge all of us to start thinking about very seriously.